Imagine you are a small living thing, drifting in a warm and sunlit sea 80 million years ago. The water around you is soft and green, and the light comes down through it in long, shifting shafts of gold. It would be beautiful if you had the mind to notice. But you are small and you are made of meat, and in this sea, that is a dangerous thing to be. Because everything here is hungry. In the bright water above you, sleek shapes are patrolling, watching for the flash of a fin or the silhouette of a body against the light. In the dim water below you, larger shadows are rising, slow and patient, their long jaws slightly open. Out in the blue, torpedo-shaped hunters are cruising, faster than anything you could ever hope to outswim. And even up at the surface, where you might rise to catch the warmth of the sun, there is no safety because there are things there too, waiting to take you the moment you break the skin of the water. There has never been a sea like this one. Across the entire history of our planet, across billions of years and countless oceans, there has never been a body of water so completely, so relentlessly, so overwhelmingly deadly. This was a sea in which every single layer of the water held a monster, a sea in which the hunters had hunters, and those hunters had hunters of their own. A sea in which there was, quite simply, nowhere to hide. Not in the depths, not on the bottom, not at the surface, not even in the air just above the waves. Everywhere you could possibly go, something was already there, waiting to kill you. Tonight, we are going to travel back to that sea and drift through its warm and murderous waters and meet the monsters that ruled it. This was the ocean of the late Cretaceous, the last great age of the dinosaurs, and it has been called, with good reason, the deadliest ocean that ever existed. We will glide beside the great sea lizards, the mosasaurs, whose jaws could swallow a person whole. We will meet the giant predatory fish that died with their own last meals still lodged in their throats. We will swim among sharks that fed upon the sea lizards themselves, and long-necked hunters that reached out of the dark, and shell-crushing titans, and a sea turtle larger than a small car that was itself hunted and torn apart. And we will discover why this particular ocean, out of all the oceans in all of time, became the single most dangerous place that life on Earth has ever produced. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always a quiet comfort to see who is joining me from around the world, listening in the dark. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, something like the sound of warm waves rolling over a shore that vanished 80 million years ago. Find your comfortable position. Take a slow, deep breath and let all the weight of the day drain away. And let us sink back through time, into the deadliest sea the world has ever known. To find the deadliest ocean that ever existed, we have to travel back to a world that would be almost unrecognizable to you, a world in the last chapter of the age of dinosaurs, around 80 million years ago. And we have to unlearn the map, because the continents were not where they are now, and the oceans were not shaped as they are now, and in one place in particular, the sea had done something extraordinary. It had risen up and cut an entire continent in two. The late Cretaceous was a greenhouse world, far warmer than our own. There were no ice caps at the poles. The great frozen reservoirs of ice that lock away so much of the world's water today simply did not exist, and so all that water was in the sea, and the sea stood high, far higher than it does now. Around the world, the warm oceans swelled and spilled over the low edges of the continents, flooding across the land, drowning coastal plains, and pushing deep into the hearts of the land masses. Shallow seas spread across places that are dry land today. And in North America, the flooding was so complete that the ocean poured in from both the north and the south and met in the middle, splitting the continent down its length into two separate lands. This great inland sea has a name. Scientists call it the Western Interior Seaway, and at its height it stretched from the Arctic Ocean in the north all the way down to the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico in the south. A vast corridor of water thousands of kilometers long and hundreds of kilometers wide, dividing the continent into an eastern landmass and a western one. Where the American Great Plains now roll dry and golden beneath the sun, where wheat grows and cattle graze and the wind moves across the grass, there was once open ocean, warm and green and teeming with life. If you had stood in what is now the middle of Kansas 80 million years ago, you would not have seen land in any direction. You would have seen only the sea, stretching to every horizon, its surface catching the light. And this sea was, by its very nature, a perfect machine for producing monsters. Consider what it was. It was warm, heated by a greenhouse climate, and warmth drives life. It was shallow, for the most part, letting sunlight reach down through much of the water, feeding the tiny drifting plants at the base of the food chain. It was rich, fed by nutrients washing in from the surrounding lands, so that the plankton bloomed in vast quantities, and the small creatures that ate the plankton multiplied, and the fish that ate them thronged the water in enormous shoals. It was, in short, one of the most productive and food-rich environments the planet had ever known, an ocean overflowing with life at every level. And where there is that much food, there will be hunters. This is the deep logic that made the sea so deadly. All that abundance, all those teeming shoals and thronging multitudes, was an invitation, an endless feast waiting to be exploited. And across millions of years, the predators came and they grew, and they diversified until every part of the sea, every layer of the water, every niche and role and opportunity was occupied by something built to kill. The richness of the sea supercharged the arms race. The more prey there was, the more predators it could support, and the more predators there were, the fiercer the competition between them and the more monstrous they became. The deadliest ocean was not deadly by accident. It was deadly because it was so alive. There is one more thing that made this sea uniquely dangerous, and it has to do with its shape. Because it was a relatively shallow, enclosed, inland sea, warm from top to bottom, there was no cold deep to escape into, no dark abyss where a fleeing creature might find refuge from the hunters of the sunlit shallows. In the great open oceans, prey can sometimes flee downward into the cold and the dark, into depths where the surface predators cannot easily follow. But in this warm, shallow, enclosed sea, there was no such escape. The whole water column from the surface to the bottom was warm and lit and full of hunters. There was no cold refuge. There was no dark sanctuary. There was only the sea and the monsters in it everywhere all the way down. And how do we know all this? How can anyone describe a sea that drained away and vanished tens of millions of years ago, that became dry prairie long before there was anyone to see it? The answer, as always, is written in the rock, and in this case the rock is chalk. As the countless tiny creatures of that ancient sea died, their microscopic shells drifted down and settled on the seafloor, year after year, for millions of years, building up into vast thick beds of soft white chalk. And into that chalk fell the bones of the monsters. Today, in the dry badlands of Kansas and across the American West, those chalk beds are exposed at the surface, and they are among the richest fossil grounds in the world, a graveyard of sea monsters preserved in stone. Every skeleton is a page, and from those pages, painstakingly, across more than a century of discovery, we have reassembled the deadliest ocean that ever was. So let us go down into it now and meet its rulers, beginning with the greatest killers of them all. Before we meet the monsters one by one, it is worth pausing to understand the shape of the danger, the reason this sea earns its terrible name above all others. Because it is not enough to say that the sea was full of predators. Many seas across many ages have been full of predators. What made this ocean the deadliest was something more specific and more total. It was that death waited in every single part of it at every level from every direction, with no gap anywhere in the net. Think of the sea as a set of layers, stacked one upon another. At the very top is the surface, the boundary between water and air, where the sunlight is brightest and where the air-breathing creatures must come to fill their lungs. Below that is the open water in between, the great volume of the sea where fish shoal and hunters cruise. Below that is the seafloor, the muddy chalk bottom where shelled creatures graze and burrow. And just above the surface in the air itself, there is one more zone, the sky over the waves, where flying creatures skim and dive. In most seas, in most ages, some of these zones offer at least a measure of safety. A creature might be vulnerable in the open water but safe on the bottom, or hunted at the surface but secure in the depths. There is usually somewhere to go, but not in this sea. In this sea, every single one of those zones was ruled by a killer. And worse, the killers of one zone reached into the others. The surface was patrolled by giant fish and by the great sea lizards rising from below. The open water was crossed by swift and monstrous sharks. The bottom held ambush hunters and shell-crushing giants, and even the sky above the waves was no refuge, because the flying reptiles that skimmed the surface to fish were themselves snatched from below, dragged down out of the air by the hunters lurking just beneath the skin of the sea. There was no zone that was safe. There was no direction from which death could not come. A creature fleeing a hunter at the surface might dive, only to meet a hunter in the deep. A creature hiding on the bottom might be crushed where it lay. A creature that took to the air above the waves might be plucked from the sky. Everywhere, in every layer, in every direction, something was waiting. And there is a further, darker layer to this. Because in this sea, the hunters were not safe either. The great predators that ruled each zone were themselves the prey of even greater predators. The sea lizards that terrorized the fish were hunted by giant sharks. The sharks fed on the sea lizards, and the sea lizards in turn sometimes ate the sharks, and both of them ate almost everything else. The food web of this sea was not a simple pyramid with one king at the top. It was a tangled, overlapping web of mutual predation, in which nearly everything was hunting nearly everything else, and in which even the largest and most fearsome monsters lived and died as prey. To be an apex predator in this sea was not to be safe. It was only to be, for a time, more dangerous than the thing that would eventually kill you. This is the true meaning of the deadliest ocean. It was not the sheer size of its monsters, though they were enormous. It was not the ferocity of any single hunter, though they were ferocious beyond anything alive today. It was the completeness of the killing, the way it filled every corner of the sea and left no gap, no refuge, no safe layer or safe direction anywhere in the water or the air above it. This was a sea that had, across millions of years of relentless arms race, been perfected into a single vast engine of predation, in which life was abundant precisely so that death could be everywhere. And now, having understood the shape of the danger, let us descend into it and meet the monsters themselves, beginning with the greatest of them all, the terrible sea lizards that rose from the deep water to rule the entire sea. Let us meet the mosasaurs. If the deadliest ocean had a king, it was the mosasaur. These were the great sea lizards of the late Cretaceous, and they were, in many ways, the defining monsters of that sea, the apex predators that ruled the deep water and rose from it to terrorize everything else. To understand them is to understand the peculiar and terrible perfection of this ocean, because the mosasaurs were newcomers, latecomers, creatures that had swept into the seas and conquered them with astonishing speed. And their reign, though it would end in catastrophe, was total while it lasted. The mosasaurs were not fish, and they were not dinosaurs. They were reptiles, and remarkably, they were lizards, close relatives of the monitor lizards and perhaps the snakes of today. Their ancestors had been land animals, or animals of the shallows, and across the Cretaceous they had returned fully to the sea and been reshaped by it, generation after generation, into some of the most formidable marine predators the world has ever seen. Their limbs became paddles. Their bodies became long and powerful and streamlined. Their tails developed into great swimming organs that drove them through the water with speed and force, and their jaws became weapons of terrible efficiency. The greatest of them was a creature called Tylosaurus, and it was a true leviathan, reaching lengths of perhaps 13 or 14 meters, longer than a bus, a monster that ruled the open water of the seaway. Picture it rising from the dim depths, its long body undulating, its great jaws lined with rows of conical, backward-curving teeth. At the front of its snout was a hard, extended, bony ram, which it may have used to stun or batter its prey. And its stomach contents, preserved in fossils, tell us exactly what it ate, which was almost everything. Fish, sharks, diving birds, smaller mosasaurs, even other predators. Tylosaurus was an apex hunter that fed across the entire sea, taking whatever it could catch, and in the deadliest ocean it could catch a great deal. But Tylosaurus was only one of many. The mosasaurs were not a single kind of monster but a whole dynasty of them, filling the sea with an entire array of sea lizards adapted to different ways of killing. There was Platecarpus, a smaller and more common mosasaur, a swift and agile hunter of fish. There was Clidestes, sleek and fast, hunting in the shallower waters. And there was one that had abandoned the way of teeth and blades entirely for something stranger. It was called Globidens, which means globe teeth, and its jaws were lined not with sharp cutting teeth, but with rounded, ball-like crushing teeth, built for a single purpose, to crush the thick shells of the clams and other shelled creatures that lived on the bottom. Here was a mosasaur that had become a shell crusher, patrolling the seafloor, breaking open the armored creatures that might have thought themselves safe inside their shells. Even the shelled and the armored had a mosasaur built specifically to eat them. What made the mosasaurs such perfect hunters was, above all, their jaws, and here they possessed something remarkable, a feature that made them uniquely terrible. Like snakes, the mosasaurs had a special hinge in the middle of their lower jaw, so that each side of the jaw could flex and move somewhat independently. And in the roof of their mouths, they had a second set of teeth, a row of backward-pointing teeth on the palate itself. When a mosasaur seized its prey, these palatal teeth would grip it and, working with the flexing jaws, ratchet the prey backward, deeper into the throat, so that anything caught could be walked down the gullet and swallowed, often whole. A creature seized in a mosasaur's jaws could not wriggle free, could not back out, could only be drawn inexorably inward and down. It was a mouth designed to ensure that nothing, once caught, ever escaped. The mosasaurs ruled this sea for millions of years, and they ruled it from below, rising out of the deeper water to take their prey and then sinking back into the dim green depths. They were the terror that came from beneath, the shadow rising, the great jaws opening in the gloom. And they were so successful, so dominant, that they spread not only through the western interior seaway but through oceans all over the world, becoming the apex marine predators of the entire late Cretaceous planet. Wherever there was warm sea, there were mosasaurs ruling it. But even these great sea lizards, these kings of the deadliest ocean, were not without enemies. Because cruising through the same water were other monsters, and some of them fed on the mosasaurs themselves. To meet them, we must turn from the sea lizards to the fish, and to a predatory fish so large and so fierce that it left its own fossilized proof of a final, fatal meal. Not all the monsters of the deadliest ocean were reptiles. Some of the most fearsome hunters in that sea were fish, and they had grown to sizes and ferocities that no fish of the sunlit surface today can match. In a sea this rich, with shoals of smaller fish thronging the water in uncountable multitudes, there was food enough to feed predatory fish of monstrous proportions, and the Cretaceous seas produced them in abundance. The greatest of these predatory fish was a creature called Xiphictinus, and it was a true monster, a bony fish that could reach lengths of 5 or 6 meters, as long as some of the smaller mosasaurs. It was heavily built, powerful, and fast, with a body somewhat like an enormous, grotesque tarpon or herring grown to nightmarish size. But its most striking feature was its face. Xiphictinus had a massive, upturned jaw, an underbite so pronounced that its lower jaw jutted out well beyond its upper, giving it the look of a snarling bulldog. And that jaw was lined with long, fang-like teeth, curved and sharp, built for seizing and impaling prey. Picture this creature rising through the green water, its huge bulldog jaw agape, its fangs gleaming, a fish the size of a small boat driving upward to seize a shoal of smaller fish or an unwary swimmer. Xiphictinus hunted by speed and ambush, accelerating from below to seize its prey and swallow it whole. And here we come to one of the most extraordinary fossils ever discovered, a fossil that tells a complete and dramatic story frozen in a single instant of death. In the chalk of Kansas, paleontologists found the skeleton of a large Xiphictinus, and inside its body, perfectly preserved within its ribcage, was the complete skeleton of another large fish, a creature called Gillicus, nearly 2 meters long, swallowed whole. The great predator had seized and gulped down a fish almost half its own length, but something had gone wrong. Perhaps the struggling prey, still alive inside the predator's body, had thrashed and torn something vital. Perhaps the meal was simply too large. Whatever the cause, the Xiphictinus died with its enormous last meal still inside it, and the two fish sank together to the bottom, and were buried in the chalk, and lay there for around 80 million years, one fish inside another, until they were found and understood. Scientists call this specimen the fish within a fish, and it is one of the most famous fossils in the world, a snapshot of the deadliness of that sea so vivid that it needs no explanation. In the deadliest ocean, even the act of eating could kill you. Xiphictinus was the giant, but the Cretaceous seas held other predatory fish that were terrible in their own right. There was a creature called Enchatus, which has earned the nickname the saber-toothed herring, a smaller fish armed with a set of enormous, dagger-like fangs at the front of its jaws, fangs so long and prominent that they made this modest-sized fish into a formidable little predator. Enchatus was abundant in the seas of the late Cretaceous, and its fanged jaws are found throughout the chalk, so common that it was clearly one of the staple prey items of the larger hunters, even as it was itself a hunter of smaller creatures. It sat in that tangled middle of the food web, predator and prey at once, its sabered mouth seizing the small while the great mosasaurs and giant fish seized it in turn. The predatory fish of this sea occupied a crucial place in the great web of killing. They were fast, they were numerous, and they hunted the shoaling fish that formed the base of the food web, converting those endless multitudes of small prey into the flesh that fed the even greater monsters above them. A mosasaur's stomach might be full of Xiphictinus and Enchatus. A giant shark might feed on all of them. The predatory fish were both the hunters of the small and the hunted of the large, a vital link in the chain that made the whole sea so relentlessly, completely deadly. And speaking of the giant sharks, it is time to meet them. For cruising through this same water was a shark so large and so powerful that it fed upon the sea lizards themselves, a shark whose teeth have been found embedded in the bones of its monstrous prey. Long before the age of the giant shark we call Megalodon, tens of millions of years earlier, the seas of the late Cretaceous were ruled in part by another great shark, one that has been given a fittingly fearsome nickname. Scientists know it as Cretixirina, but it is often called the Jinsu shark, named for a brand of famously sharp knives, because its teeth were so keen and its bite so effective at slicing through flesh and bone. In the deadliest ocean, the Jinsu shark was one of the most formidable hunters of all, a swift and powerful predator that fed on almost everything, including the great sea lizards themselves. Cretixirina was a large shark, reaching perhaps 7 meters in length, comparable in size and build to a large modern great white, and it was built for the same kind of hunting, fast, powerful pursuit and devastating attacks. Its teeth were smooth, sharp, and blade-like, perfectly designed for cutting, and it possessed them in great numbers, rows upon rows of slicing blades. It was fast, driven through the water by a powerful tail, and it was almost certainly warm-bodied to some degree, like the great predatory sharks of today, able to keep its muscles warm and its speed high in pursuit of its prey. It was, in short, a superbly equipped killing machine, and it cruised the open water of the seaway hunting fish, turtles, plesiosaurs, and the mosasaurs themselves. We know that Cretixirina attacked mosasaurs because the evidence is written directly into the fossils. Paleontologists have found the bones of mosasaurs bearing the distinctive bite marks and gouges of shark teeth, and in some cases, actual shark teeth have been found embedded in or associated with mosasaur remains, broken off in the act of feeding. Whether the Jinsu shark was killing living mosasaurs or scavenging their carcasses is not always certain, and both surely happened, but the picture is clear enough. The great sharks and the great sea lizards fed upon one another, locked in a mutual and murderous relationship, each one both predator and prey to the other. Imagine a 7-meter shark and a 13-meter mosasaur, two of the deadliest hunters the sea has ever produced, meeting in the green water and the terrible violence that must have followed. This was the daily reality of the deadliest ocean. Cretixirina was the giant, but it was not the only shark in that sea. There was another, smaller shark that played a different but equally important role. It was called Squalocorax, and it is sometimes known as the crow shark. Squalocorax was not as large or as fast as the Jinsu shark, but it was abundant, and it was the great scavenger of the seaway, feeding on the dead and dying, cleaning up the carcasses of the countless creatures that died in that sea. We know this, again, from remarkable direct evidence. A tooth of Squalocorax was found embedded in the foot bone of a dinosaur, a land animal, which means that the carcass of a dinosaur had somehow ended up in the sea, perhaps washed out by a river, and the scavenging sharks had fed upon it. The crow shark ate whatever it could find, living or dead, and in a sea where so many creatures were dying so constantly, there was always a great deal to find. The sharks of the deadliest ocean occupied a special and sinister place in its web of death. They were hunters, yes, swift and powerful predators of the living. But they were also the cleaners, the recyclers, the ever-present scavengers that ensured nothing dead remained uneaten for long. In this sea, to die was not to find peace, but simply to become food, seized within moments by the questing sharks. The violence did not end with death. It continued as the scavengers moved in until every scrap of flesh had been consumed, and only the bones remained to drift down and settle into the chalk. The sharks made certain that the deadliest ocean wasted nothing, that every death fed new life, that the great engine of predation ran without pause, day and night, for millions of years. But before we meet the next of the sea's great hunters, there is a hidden vulnerability in this ocean worth understanding, a weakness woven into the very bodies of its greatest monsters, and it reveals yet another reason why the surface of this sea was the most dangerous place of all. It has to do with something as simple and as inescapable as the need to breathe. Here is a fact about the deadliest ocean that changes how you see all of it. Many of its greatest monsters, the mosasaurs, the plesiosaurs, the pliosaurs, the giant turtles, could not breathe underwater. They were reptiles, air-breathing creatures, descended from ancestors that had lived on land, and for all their mastery of the sea, they had never regained the ability to draw oxygen from the water as a fish does through its gills. They breathed air into lungs, exactly as you do, and that single fact placed upon them an inescapable burden, a vulnerability that shaped their entire lives and made the surface of the sea into the most dangerous place in the whole deadly ocean. Think about what it means to be a great sea lizard that must breathe air. No matter how perfectly adapted you are to the water, no matter how powerful your jaws or how streamlined your body, you cannot stay beneath the surface forever. Again and again, throughout your life, you must return to the top of the sea, break the surface, and fill your lungs with air. You have no choice. To fail to do so is to drown, to suffocate, to die as surely as if you had been seized by a predator. And so, over and over, every hunter that breathed air was compelled to rise, to leave the concealing depths, to expose itself at the boundary between water and sky, in the brightest and most visible part of the whole sea. The need to breathe was a leash that pulled every air-breathing monster, again and again, up into the light. And the surface, as we have seen, was a killing zone. When a mosasaur or a plesiosaur rose to breathe, it entered the shallow, sunlit waters where it could be seen from a distance, where its silhouette showed against the bright sky above, where it was, for a moment, at its most exposed. A young or injured or careless air breather, rising to fill its lungs, might be spotted by a larger predator and attacked in that vulnerable instant. The very act of breathing, the most basic requirement of staying alive, forced these creatures into danger. In the deadliest ocean, you could not even take a breath without risk. The surface was not a refuge from the hunting below. It was, for the air breathers, a place they were compelled to visit and yet could never be safe in, a trap they had to enter simply to keep living. This is part of why the surface of the deadliest ocean was so deadly, and why the killing reached all the way up to the boundary of the air. The sea was full of creatures that had to come up to breathe, and full of hunters ready to take them when they did. A mosasaur rising for air might be attacked by a larger mosasaur, or by a great shark drawn to the movement at the surface. A plesiosaur, lifting its small head above the water to breathe, exposed the long, vulnerable column of its neck. A giant turtle, surfacing to fill its lungs, presented itself to any predator cruising nearby. The surface, which should have been a place of light and air and relief, was instead a gauntlet that every air-breathing creature had to run over and over throughout its entire life, from birth until the day it finally failed to survive the crossing. There is something almost cruel in this arrangement, in the way the deadliest ocean turned even the act of breathing into a danger. It meant that its greatest monsters, for all their power, lived under a constant low burden of risk that never lifted, a vulnerability built into their very biology. They ruled the sea, and yet they were tethered to the surface by their own lungs, forced again and again into the most exposed place in the whole ocean. And it meant that the sea's web of death was even tighter than it first appears, because it captured not only the weak and the small but the great hunters themselves, in the unavoidable moment when they rose to breathe. Even the kings of the deadliest ocean had to come up for air, and in that moment, even the kings could die. It is worth remembering, too, that these air-breathing reptiles had to solve the problem of reproduction in the deadly sea, and the solutions were themselves shaped by the danger. Many of the marine reptiles, including the mosasaurs and the plesiosaurs, appear to have given birth to live young in the water, rather than laying eggs on land as their distant ancestors had done. To return to land to lay eggs would have meant hauling their massive, water-adapted bodies out onto a shore, slow and helpless, and it seems that most had abandoned this entirely, giving birth to fully formed young directly into the sea. But this meant that their newborns entered the deadliest ocean from the very first moment of their lives, small and vulnerable, surrounded on every side by hunters. A newborn mosasaur or plesiosaur, drawing its first breath at the surface of that murderous sea, was already in the most dangerous place in the world, already prey, already part of the endless web of killing. In the deadliest ocean, life began in danger and remained in danger until it ended, and even the simple acts of breathing and being born were bound up with the constant nearness of death. Now, having understood this hidden vulnerability that shaped even the greatest monsters, let us return to our tour of the sea's rulers and meet the strange and elegant long-necked hunters whose bodies have puzzled scientists for over a century. Among the most iconic and mysterious of all the monsters of the deadliest ocean were the plesiosaurs, the long-necked marine reptiles whose strange and beautiful forms have haunted the human imagination ever since their bones were first discovered. These were not the fastest